We're not going to be discussing the culture of India. And when I'm thinking about like the progression of our discussion of these cultures in class, I always think of a globe being spun. What do I mean by this? We started in Africa. So if you think of what's to the west of this map, right? If you took and went left or went west on the map, you would run into Africa. So when I think about our progression in the class, we start in Africa and we keep spinning our globe and moving eastward because we're moving into India, right? And then after that, we're going to move into a discussion of China and Japan and so forth. So again, we're sort of moving, as we push the globe, right? We're moving eastward in this class. We're going to touch a little bit on Nepalese because, of course, the Buddha was actually from Nepal, which you see is to the north, right, east of India. So we'll think a little bit about, again, the fact that Nepal is related to India. But again, I wanted to give you this map to give you some context, right, for where is India, what is it located near. Buddhism, for instance, will travel out of India into places like Thailand, Vietnam, China. So I also like this larger map because it gives you a sense of the interconnectedness of these regions and how a religion might travel, might we say. Buddhism will travel out of India. It's not really considered an Indian religion as much today as it is considered a global religion. But Hinduism is considered very Indian. So again, just some thoughts on the religions we're going to be talking about here as we talk about Indian culture and art. So Indian culture begins with the early Indus River Valley civilization. If you've studied cultures, you know they always develop by a river. So in the case of India, it's the Indus River. Go to Egypt, you get the Nile. Mesopotamia, right, you get the Tigris and the Euphrates. So you always have a river that these early cultures are dependent on. And most cultures were arising around 4000 BC. Whenever we talk about like sort of the start of civilization across the globe, you're always looking about 4000 BC. Before that, they were prehistoric cultures. Which meant they didn't have writing or documentation, of course. So here in India, we're looking at the Indus River Valley. We look primarily at two cities here, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. If you look at the bottom right image, you'll notice that this is the excavated archaeological ruins of Mohenjo-daro. There's not really much to see. So when you excavate archaeologically a lot of these early places, you get foundations, you get a sense of the layout of the spaces, but of course not much is left behind. So that's why I gave you the reconstruction drawing on the upper left. So you could get a sense of what we think the city looked like when it actually was flourishing and people were living here. Now, what kind of objects do we find at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro? We find objects that tell us a little bit about the kind of people who lived here and the civilizations they were starting to build. These people have writing, so they're not prehistoric, right? They are moving into historic culture. But at the same time, it's a writing that we don't have any ability to decipher. You'll notice it's pictographic in nature, meaning it's made up of pictures. Most early languages are pictographic. You can look at cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt, and so forth. Of course, Chinese, Japanese, those are still modern pictographic languages that then are aligned with phonograms, right? Or phonetics or sounds. So again, they are usually, these early languages are usually pictographic because what we think happened is they felt that people could understand pictures better than they could understand like a phonetic system. To them, that would seem easier. Today, if you actually look at pictographic languages, most people consider them harder to learn because you have to learn the pictographs as well as the phonographs. You have to kind of marry them together. And they're tonal languages normally. Like when I was in China, I learned a little bit of Chinese, but they were like, don't try to talk too much. Because again, my knowledge of the phonograms, the phonetics of the language, the tonality of the language was very limited because I speak English as a primary language. And my brain couldn't kind of wrap myself around the idea of you can see a word written out phonetically, but a Chinese person might say it like 8 different ways tonally. And each way they say it tonally means something different. So you can see how complex a lot of these linguistic systems get. Very, very hard. So again, you can see some writing on here, but again, we don't know what it says. But it gives us some insight into maybe what was important to them. Early cultures, of course, were always thinking about what they needed. So perhaps, these images relate to the kind of animals they were raising for sustenance and such. What I love the most, of course, is on the bottom left. It's a little toy that probably was made for a child. So just like today, you might give a kid like a fire truck. Back then, they said, okay, well, what do? We go out into the fields, right, and we harvest things, and we pull them, on our carts. So a little kid might have sat around and played with his little oxen cart, and pulled things around with it. I just think it's really kind of fun. And again, it shows you that if you look back at old cultures, they are like us in a lot of ways. They were like us. They were doing things. They had kids. Kids wanted toys. So we tend to sort of think of them as outside of, a sense of what we do on the day-to-day, but I don't think so. I think it's better for us to consider the fact that they were real people with real concerns and real lives. On the top, you get a sense of perhaps how the genders were shown. The man, you'll notice, is shown kind of with this ornamented wrap and this ornamented beard. And then you have the female figure, which looks almost very fertility-esque. We can't really say much about these pieces, but again, it might tell us a little bit about gender depiction in this culture. So again, some objects from these early cities. Now, what I really focus on when I teach you guys art in India is the religion of India. So that's the context that I use. And the reason why is because to me, most of their art is connected to religion. So you kind of have to go there, right, to understand their culture, especially their historic culture, the beginnings of their culture. So I always joke that you get a twofer in this class. You get, your art, but you also get like a very big religion lesson as well. So in the earliest religions, the earliest religious sort of ideas in India were linked to what's called the Vedic text or the Vedas. So if you really want to go back really far to their roots, you can go look at the Vedic texts and read some of those. But we're going to concentrate on their two primary religions, which are Hinduism and Buddhism. Of course, you also have like Jainism and other sort of offshoots, and you're welcome to explore those as well. They're very interesting. But for our purposes and our time constraints, I'm going to focus on Hinduism and Buddhism and the kind of art connected to those religions. Now, I wanted to make a case about the idea of what these two religions share before we go into talking about each specific religion. Because what we find is these religions do share a lot of commonality. Hinduism comes along first, so we'll talk about it first, but we find that Buddhism pulls in a lot of the ideas that the Hindus were using, with, of course, some variations. But I wanted to kind of think about, the main sort of ideas that they shared first, and then jump into Hinduism, and then jump into Buddhism after that. So I wanted to go along through these points and kind of elucidate a little bit on them. The first thing I wanted to make sure you're very clear about is the idea of time. I mentioned in the African introduction that time would be very different for these non-Western cultures. And here in India, that's very, very true. Indians, to me, believe in time almost like it's an egg or a circle, something to be born into being and then fizzle out in a sense. So I always think of it like an egg, like you crack the egg, make your omelet, right? It comes into being, it's used up and, it has to be regenerated again. Or I like to talk about their time like pearls on a chain. What do I mean by this? So Indian time, they talk about how they believe there are spheres of time that come into being, exist, and then have to be extinguished. And that they all sort of link up with one another. So to me, I almost think of it like a necklace. Like pearls on a necklace, kind of linking together. Instead of time being linear, right, they believe that time is cyclical or circular in nature and that many ages of time have gone by. When we talk about reincarnation, this may, again, seem even more clear to you. But they believe that time is created, wears itself out in a sense, and then has to be reborn. Just like people being reincarnated. If you think about African time was this idea that like once an idea is forgotten, is it of importance any longer? I I find most non-Western cultures aren't really about remembering everything that ever happened, and they're not about traditional linear time. To make this point, I always show you Shiva in his guise as the Nataraja, or the destroyer. We'll talk a little bit more about Shiva when we get into Hinduism, and Shiva had many what we call guises, or ways that he's represented. If you've heard the word disguise, right? A disguise is something you do to mar your guise, or mar the way you look, change it. And so when you say something is in the guise of something, you're saying it looks like something. So Shiva will have different what we call guises, or different roles that he plays. So this is just one of them that you're seeing here, but it's probably the most well-known, which is the Shiva Nataraja, or the destroyer. Now, this idea of time, right, coming into being and being extinguished when it's no longer useful. Shiva, it was his job to destroy time. It was Vishnu's job to create it. So with the cycle for Hindus, Vishnu would create a time bubble, or a time pearl, might we say, or a time egg, and he'd launch it into motion, right? And then time would go along, but then perhaps things were getting bad or getting rocky. So Shiva was called in to dance his dance of destruction. As you'll notice, he's posed as if he's dancing. He would dance so fast and so furiously that this ring of fire would erupt, and it would burn the world age to a cinder, hence putting into motion, creating it again. You'll notice he's dancing on top of a dwarf. The dwarf represented ignorance. The idea of why the world has to end, well, ignorance becomes so prominent that the world must die and be born again. So maybe perhaps our better angels can reign. So when you're thinking about time in the Indian thought pattern, it's good to think about, I think, some of these metaphors. This idea of pearls on a chain, Shiva destroying time, right? The egg of time, burning it out. And I'd mentioned to you that you see a lot of circles in Indian art and culture. And again, you can definitely see that here. So I think it's important to consider that, again, they're not linear time thinkers like Westerners are. And they think about the space of time and how many spaces of time we've inhabited as being almost infinite in nature. This is because they think that the world is an illusion too. They think it's very carefully crafted, and we cling to that crafting of what we call Maya. Maya literally means illusion to them, or untruth. So if you know somebody with the name Maya, they might have an Indian heritage or Indian background where it's about the fact that you can't trust the things that you see, that they are illusory in nature. So Indians believe that the things around us are very carefully crafted to keep us in this existence, to be tempting, to be pleasurable, to be things that don't allow us to see beyond, to try to find a way out, right? And in a sense, keep us locked here in this existence. But the things around you, they aren't true. They're there to try to delude you, might we say. And they believe that, there's this idea of karma, that every action we take, every move we make, right, is loaded with meaning for overall spiritual sense of ourselves. That nothing is without action and reaction, let us say. So in the Indian sense, you do things and things have karma within them. You do a good action, you reap good karma. You do a bad action, you reap bad karma. In a sense, what you do comes back to you. And they believe that your reincarnation is guided by this karmic action. I always like this a little bit because, I'm sure everyone's always known a jerk or two in their world. And it gives me comfort to think maybe if the Indians were right, that they will pay for their karma. Their karma will come back to them. But if you do good things, you'll karmically benefit. There's something righteous about it, right? There's something nice about it that I find to be comforting. It kind of leads you away from the idea that nothing you do matters, right? The idea that everything you do are doing in your world matters. Everything is important and has import to you and where you're going. We'll talk a little bit about how the idea of dharma also figures into this, that your karma relates to your dharma, or doing things according to your station as well. The Hindus will have a caste system, so we'll talk a little bit about how dharma figures into karma in reference to the caste system as well. Now, reincarnation, this is probably a word you have heard and have some idea about. Most Western religions do not believe in reincarnation, but most Eastern religions do, right? So Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Hindu, Buddhist, this is something that's very big, right, in what we call Eastern thinking, is the idea that, in a sense, what you do, your karma, right, that it sets up, in a sense, your starting position within reincarnation. And in the mind of Indian thinkers, they believe that you keep spinning through your own egg of time, might we say. You keep getting born, you live, you die, you get reincarnated, you get reborn. You keep doing that over and over and over again until you can figure out how to become enlightened. And that your karma, in a sense, figures into your reincarnation start position. Indians believe that there are various levels, right, that you can be reincarnated at. With the caste system, for instance, they believe that there are different stations you could be, reincarnated into as far as your social status. And they also believe that you can be reincarnated as a lower being, right, an animal and such, if you have bad karma. This is why a lot of Indians are vegetarians, by the way, because, you don't want to eat Uncle Bob, right? So what if you had this guy in your family who was kind of mean and nasty, and you're like, well, you're kind of looking at, your hamburger like, well, he could have been this cow. I don't know. Of course, cow is sacred in Indian religions, but you get my point. So again, a lot of vegetarianism relates to reincarnation. It also relates to this idea of doing no harm to no being. So for instance, with Jains, I mentioned that Jainism is very interesting. They don't believe in harming any living thing. They only eat fruit that drops to the ground off a tree naturally. Like, they won't pick an apple off a tree. They feel that's harming the tree. If they're going to build something, they'll actually sift the dirt at the building site to make sure, like, all bugs, all worms, anything in the dirt that's living is removed. They're very serious about, like, not harming another living thing for any reason of any kind. So again, a lot of this is related to reincarnation and the idea that everything around you has a soul, has an energy, and you're not sure, where that entity is in the cycle of reincarnation. So again, your karma, right, relates to your starting position. And as I already mentioned, the caste system is something that we'll talk about with Hindus as far as reincarnation is concerned. Your ultimate goal is to reach nirvana. So many people have to go through very many cycles, a lot of cycles of reincarnation, but their end goal is to try to reach nirvana or try to reach enlightenment, essentially. To leave Maya, to leave the illusion of this world and be free of it. To not fall for the delusion that's around them every day. The happy things, the pretty things, right? The shiny baubles. How do you move beyond the surface, right, of pleasure, let's say, to, the greater issues or the greater thoughts? How do you strip away from yourself all attachment? How do you strip away from yourself all need to become pure, to let your mind be completely empty of any concerns? This is really what they're striving for when they're striving for nirvana. And again, it's something that most Indians think takes you a long time, that you're reincarnated many, many times. During that, though, you're in what we call samsara. You're in the wheel of reincarnation. So I like these diagrams because it gives you a sense of how how the wheel of samsara works. And I bring up the wheel of samsara because, again, circles, wheels, it's very much a part of Indian symbology. With the Buddha, for instance, he'll say, I turn the wheel of the law, right? I rotate the wheel of the law when I teach. So wheels kind of always come up. And I've said, you get born, you live, you die, you're reborn. So here on the old view graph, you'll notice it's birth, incarnate, or when you're living, death, and then you're just incarnated, and then you're reborn again. So birth, life, death, rebirth, birth, life, death, rebirth, birth, life, death, rebirth. You get the point. Over and over and over again on the wheel of samsara until you can make your play for nirvana. Hindus believe you have to be of the highest caste to reach nirvana. Buddhists believe anyone can reach nirvana with practice. So that's also how they will differ from one another as far as who is reaching nirvana and when, right? I'd say Hinduism is a little bit more strict about their rules. Buddhism is very open free-flowing, right, about their rules. Again, this is probably the most important thing to be thinking about is the reincarnation cycle of samsara, spinning that wheel until you find nirvana, right? Wanted to speak a little bit to practice, and just a few things that I think are important to point out that differ amongst Buddhists and Hindus. Buddha, for instance, is not a god in the Buddhist system, but the Hindus have many, many gods. They're often called like the religion of 10,000 gods or 100,000 gods and things like this. There's a lot of Hindu gods running around. So when I talk to you about Hinduism, I'm going to have to pick a few. I can't talk to you about all of them. We would never have the time. But it is important to recognize that Buddha is not a god. He was a teacher. He was a philosopher. Some people argue whether we should call Buddhism a religion, because it's more of a philosophy. It's not really religious in the sense of how most religions are. But again, tomato, tomato, right? You can ponder this yourself if you wish to. And I bring this up because I've been in enough travel situations where, I'm in Thailand or in China or in wherever in Asia, and I'll be with like a bunch of tourists, and we'll go to a Buddhist temple, and they'll say, well, I can't go in there. It's blasphemous. I'm Christian. And I'm like, well, he's not a god. Like, you can go in there all you want. But again, I think it's hard for someone who grows up in one religious tradition to understand that, like, this person is not a god, even though there's a big gold statue of him, Again, what his followers do to celebrate him doesn't change the fact that he wasn't a godhead. It's not what he wanted, and it's not what he was, right? For Buddhists, they have no clergy, and clergy means holy people, essentially. So no priests, ministers, any of that kind of stuff. They have no clergy, and they have no holy days. Buddhism is very much a practice, I always say. It's not really about celebration or having celebratory rites. Hindus have many festivals, many gurus or teachers. They have a lot of this, right? So they have a lot of festival. They have a lot of, of the fun stuff, might we say, like Holi and Diwali and different kinds of things. So they have teachers, they have festivals, lots of that. For both religions, it's a very personal decision to meditate. So when you meet a Hindu or a Buddhist, you might either be surprised or not surprised about how much they meditate. I have a lot of Hindu families in my neighborhood, and they talk a lot about, like, we're in the part of our lives where we're raising families, so we're in the householder stage, and so, we don't have as much time to meditate as we'd like. And, when you ask them about, like, reincarnation, nirvana, they're like, yeah, we're kind of the understanding that we probably will be in this for a couple more cycles. So it's interesting how they will sometimes talk about nirvana, meditation, reincarnation, and where they feel they are in their own cycle of samsara, or their own cycle of achieving enlightenment in a very open kind of way. But it's a personal decision. It's based on your family, or based on your profession, or based on how much time you have. We'll see with Buddhists, they can go into monastery, they cannot. But there's no real outside entity controlling, the decision to meditate there. And of course, as I mentioned before, Hindus will have much more structure, right, due to the caste system. Now, why am I telling you all this about religion? Because, to them, art is worship. It's darsana, as they put it. It's practicing art to practice their religion. So as I mentioned before, I don't think you can talk about these art pieces without going very deep into their religion, because you wouldn't understand them. They'd have no point or no purpose. So to them, the darsana, the practice of worship, is filtered through the idea of the art that they make. But one kind of final last thing, right? But again, their art is different in why they make it and what they believe it represents. For Hindus, on the right, it's an image of Ganesha. They believe that the statuary actually is a physical manifestation of the god. So to them, when they create a statue, they believe that then the god then manifests or inhabits it. So if you ran at this statue of Ganesha with a hammer, you probably would get tackled by a few Hindus, because they'd be like, you can't attack the god. Now, on the other side of this, Buddhists believe that art is just a representation of something. It's just an easy way to show you stories. So, in the case of the Buddhist statue you see on the left, they would say, well, the Buddha's not there. He's not in the statue, you know. This is just a way of showing you him in meditation in order to make clear that story to you. So if you attacked it with a hammer, I'm sure they would find it distasteful, but they wouldn't be trying to tackle you probably like the Hindus would. So again, there's a big stark difference here between representation and manifestation, as I say, and the fact that Hindus think these sculptures are very holy, where again, Buddhists would say they're just images of things. They're just a way of jogging your memory and having you be like, oh, okay, yeah, the Buddha doing that thing, right? So again, very, very different ideas. As I mentioned, now we'll talk about about Hinduism, because Hinduism is the first manifestation, right, of very organized, right, Indian religion, and then we'll move into Buddhism after that.